Having arrived with only a fraction of his force due to the weakened bridge, Captain Lee stood among the ruins of the gatehouse as the SS launched their final assault. Looking at the burning tank and Gangel's body, he watched Jean Barotra vault over the wall under sniper fire. As the Frenchman disappeared into the forest in search of reinforcements, Lee raised his rifle, determined to make his last 16 rounds count. The defenders opened fire, plunging into a desperate fight through the citadel's corridors. I hope this story hits you as hard as it hit me while writing it. Links in the channel description. Get comfortable, hit subscribe, and let's dive in. The Tyrolean peaks of the Austrian Alps shimmered with a deceptive emerald tranquility in early May 1945. At 666 meters above the sea, Castle Itter stood as a jagged crown of stone overlooking the Brixental Valley. Its massive walls and neo-Gothic spires, rebuilt during the late 19th century, projected an image of medieval invincibility. Yet the atmosphere within was thick with the stench of a dying Reich. Adolf Hitler had been dead for 3 days, and while the end of the war was officially a certainty, the mountains remained a dangerous pocket of chaos. Within the castle's Tudor-style rooms, a surreal collection of French dignitaries lived in a state of suspended animation. Former prime ministers Édouard Daladier and Paul Reynaud moved through the fountain courtyard with the cautious gait of men who had spent years as VIP pawns of the SS. Despite their shared captivity, the old political rivalries remained so sharp that they occupied separate tables during meals, their internal discord a mirror of the fractured world they had left behind. They were joined by General Maurice Gamelin and the polarizing Maxime Weygand, along with the tennis champion Jean Barotra and Marie-Agnès de Gaulle, the general's sister. The guards of the SS Totenkopfverbände maintained a regime of forced politeness, a fragile mask that began to slip following the suspicious death of Edward Weiter, the last commandant of Dachau, on the 2nd of May. Command of the prison now rested with Sebastian Wimmer, a man increasingly paralyzed by fear as the American lines drew closer. The prisoners watched the horizon, listening to the static-heavy whispers of the BBC on a radio hidden by Zvonimir Kukovic, the Yugoslavian laborer they knew as Andre. On the 3rd of May, under the pretext of running an errand for Wimmer, Kukovic pedaled a bicycle out through the formidable gatehouse. In his pocket he carried a letter written in English, a desperate plea for help addressed to the first Allied soldiers he could find. As he navigated the 40 miles toward Innsbruck, passing German checkpoints with a pounding heart, the prisoners in the castle braced for the inevitable. Wimmer and his guards soon abandoned their posts, leaving the French elite to arm themselves with discarded weapons, realizing that the most fanatical elements of the SS were still roaming the forests, eager to settle final accounts before the curtain fell. The war was over in the papers, but for the inhabitants of Itter, the true fight for survival was only just beginning. By midday on the 4th of May, the oppressive silence of Castle Itter was broken by the rhythmic clicking of a bicycle chain as Andreas Krobot, the prison's Czech cook, pedaled toward the town of Vorgl. Kuchkovic had not returned, and the desperation among the French dignitaries had reached a fever pitch. In Vorgl, Krobot found not just the Austrian resistance, but Major Josef Sepp Gangel, a veteran of the Eastern Front and the Kahn sector, who had decided he was finished with the fanatical directives of the SS. Gangel, a 34-year-old father of 2, had already begun positioning his remaining Wehrmacht soldiers to protect the townspeople from roving Nazi execution squads. When Krobot delivered the plea for help, Gangel realized he lacked the manpower to storm the fortress alone. Under a precarious white flag, Gangel drove north toward Kufstein, seeking an enemy he could trust more than his own high command. On the town square, he encountered First Lieutenant John C. Jack Lee, Jr., a rugged, cigar-chewing commander from the 12th Armored Division. Lee, standing beside his M4A3 Sherman tank, besotted Jenny, listened to the German officer's report through a haze of whiskey and pragmatism. The tactical risk was staggering. The castle was isolated, and the surrounding woods crawled with elements of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division. Without hesitation, Lee volunteered to lead the rescue, forming one of the most improbable alliances of the war. The briefing was brief and sharp. After a daring personal reconnaissance in Gangel's Kugelwagen, Lee organized a scratch force. 14 American soldiers, Gangel's small contingent of defecting German artillerymen, and a truckload of reinforcements. As they moved out, the psychological weight of the mission settled over the group. The American GIs, including 6 African-American infantrymen from the 17th Armored Infantry Battalion, sat in grim silence alongside the Wehrmacht soldiers they had been trying to kill only days prior. There were no grand speeches, only the mechanical roar of the Sherman's Ford V8 engine and the metallic clatter of stowing gear. Their progress was slowed when a bridge proved too fragile for the heavy tanks, forcing Lee to send back his reinforcements and leave one Sherman behind as a guard. Now reduced to a single tank and a handful of men, the column pressed upward into the mountains. 4 miles from the castle, they smashed through an SS roadblock, the brief, violent exchange of fire cementing the grim resolve of the German-American team. As the sun dipped behind the Tyrolean peaks, casting long, jagged shadows over the road, Lee stood in the turret of the Sotten Jenny, his eyes fixed on the stone towers of Itter, knowing that the night ahead would either forge a legend or become a mass grave. Would you like me to proceed with Chapter 3, detailing the arrival at the castle and the first night of the siege? The twilight over Castle Itter was shattered not by a grand arrival, but by the low, guttural growl of a lone M4A3 Sherman clawing its way up the winding mountain path. As Besottin Jenny lurched into the courtyard on the evening of May 4th, the French dignitaries gathered near the 13th century fountain, their faces etched with a mixture of relief and visible disappointment. They had expected a liberating army. Instead, they were met by Lieutenant Jack Lee, dirty, smelling of burnt oil and cheap whiskey, and a handful of unwashed American GIs standing alongside their former German enemies. Paul Reynaud watched from a balcony, later noting Lee's crude appearance and brusque manners, a stark contrast to the polite, doomed elegance of the old world. The calm of the arrival vanished within minutes. Lee, moving with the aggressive efficiency of a man who had fought from France to the Austrian border, immediately began transforming the medieval fortress into a modern kill zone. He ordered the Sherman to be positioned directly at the main gatehouse, its 75mm gun commanding the only approach road. "Keep the engine warm," he barked at Sergeant Rushford, the metallic tang of exhaust fumes already heavy in the cool alpine air. Inside the castle, a new figure emerged. SS Hauptsturmführer Kurt Siegfried Schrader. Recovering from wounds and having befriended the prisoners, Schrader chose humanity over his black uniform, joining Lee and Major Gangel to coordinate the defense. It was a tableau of the impossible. A cigar-chomping American, a decorated Wehrmacht major, and an SS officer huddled over a map, plotting to kill the very men they were once sworn to lead. Night fell like a heavy shroud, and with the darkness came the sounds of the forest, breathing with malice. The 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, Götz von Berlichingen, was no longer a shadow in the woods. They were a hunting party of 150 fanatical soldiers armed with MG-42 machine guns and Panzerfausts. Around midnight, the first cracks of Kar-98 rifles echoed off the stone walls. Then came the screaming sound of a flare, bathing the courtyard in a haunting, magnesium-white glare. "Contacts! East Woods!" a GI screamed from the ramparts. The darkness erupted into a chaotic symphony of tracers. The German defenders, formerly Gangel's men, opened up with their Mauser rifles, the sharp crack-crack blending with the heavy rhythmic thud of the Sherman's 50 caliber machine gun. Lee stood in the turret, the flickering light of the muzzle flashes reflecting in his eyes as he directed fire toward the tree line. The smell of cordite and ozone filled the gatehouse, stinging the nostrils of the French politicians who had refused to hide. Jean Barotra and Edouard Daladier moved through the shadows, hauling ammunition crates with a desperate, newfound purpose, their political grudges forgotten in the face of annihilation. The SS were probing, testing the perimeter with lethal intent. A group of infiltrators attempted to rush the lower dry moat, their silhouettes darting between the trees. Lee felt the vibration of the castle floors as a German grenade detonated against the outer masonry, a dull crump that sent stone splinters whistling through the air. "They're checking our blind spots," Gangle shouted over the din, his voice a calm anchor in the storm. He moved with the practiced grace of a veteran, positioning his men to cover the gaps in the crumbling wall. The skirmish was a frantic, sensory assault. The high-pitched zipping of SS machine guns, the Hitler's saw, tore through the night, answered by the slower, deeper bark of American Garands. In the intervals between bursts, Lee could hear the frantic shouting of German commands from the woods and the clatter of boots on the castle's ancient cobblestones. The besotten Jenny roared, its main gun spitting a shell into the tree line, the concussion shaking the very foundations of the 10th century fortress. For hours, the defenders traded lead with an invisible foe, the flashes of light revealing glimpses of the black-clad grenadiers closing the circle. By 3 in the morning, the probe subsided into a tense, vibrating silence, but no one slept. The air remained thick with the scent of spent brass and pine needles. Lee looked at Gangle. Both men knew this was merely the prelude. The SS had seen enough to know the castle's weaknesses. As the first hint of gray light began to touch the peaks of the North Tyrol, the defenders clutched their rifles, their knuckles white against the wood and steel. They had survived the night, but the sun would bring the heavy steel of the 88mm guns and the full fury of a Reich that refused to die. The strange alliance of Itter stood on the precipice, waiting for the dawn that would bring the main assault. The morning of May 5, 1945 did not arrive with a gentle dawn, but with the bone-shaking scream of an 88mm anti-tank shell. The projectile struck the upper masonry of Castle Itter's north tower at precisely 4 in the morning, showering the courtyard in a deadly rain of stone shards and ancient mortar. One heavy brick tumbled from the parapet, striking the wife of SS Hauptsturmführer Schroeder and leaving her bleeding and dazed in the chaos. The air, once crisp with the scent of alpine pine, was instantly choked by a thick gray veil of pulverized limestone and the biting stench of cordite. Lieutenant Jack Lee stood in the turret of the Besotten Jenny, his jaw clamped tight around a cold cigar as he scanned the tree line through his binoculars. He knew that sound, the flat, terrifying crack of the most lethal gun in the German arsenal. The SS had moved an 88mm gun into a concealed position on the opposite ridge, and they were using it to systematically dismantle the castle's teeth. Moments later, a second shell whistled across the valley. It struck the Sherman tank squarely in the hull. The impact was a physical blow that rattled the teeth of every defender within the walls. Flame and black oily smoke erupted from the engine deck of the M4A3. The tank's radio operator, who had been frantically trying to restore communication with the outside world, scrambled out of the hatch just as the Ronson began to brew up. He rolled onto the cobblestones, miraculously unhurt, but the heart of the defense was gone. The Besotten Jenny was a flaming pyre, its 50-caliber machine gun silenced, leaving the gatehouse vulnerable to the swarming infantry. With the tank destroyed, the Waffen-SS launched their main assault. Over 150 fanatical soldiers of the Gotz von Berlichingen division began a disciplined, lethal crawl toward the walls. They moved with Panzerfausts and MG-42 machine guns, pinning the defenders behind the crenellations. The volume of fire was staggering. Bullets chipped away at the fountain where centuries of history were being erased by 7.92mm rounds. Inside the fortress, the situation turned from desperate to catastrophic. Communication lines had been severed, and ammunition was running dangerously low. Lee was forced to order his men to abandon the outer walls and retreat deeper into the keep. The French dignitaries, however, ignored his commands to hide in the cellar. Paul Reynaud, the 67-year-old former prime minister, took up a position at a window with a submachine gun, his face a mask of aristocratic defiance as he traded fire with the black-clad figures in the brush. Beside him, his rival, Daladier, worked with grim efficiency, the political hatreds of a lifetime dissolved by the immediate necessity of survival. The crisis reached its agonizing peak when a sniper's bullet, fired from a high-velocity Mauser, zipped through a gap in the defenses. Major Joseph Sepp Gangel saw Reynaud exposed in a dangerous opening and lunged forward to pull the Frenchman to safety. In that moment of selfless clarity, the sniper's round found its mark. The bullet struck Gangel in the head, killing him instantly. The German officer tumbled to the stone floor, the blood of a man who had chosen honor over his own side, pooling on the cold floor of the castle he had fought to save. He was the only defender to fall that day, a professional soldier who died protecting a man he might have considered a bitter enemy only years before. The loss of Gangel sent a wave of cold reality through the remaining defenders. Several of the Wehrmacht soldiers and American GIs were now wounded, the groans of the injured echoing in the narrow stone corridors. The SS were now at the gatehouse, a demolition team crouching low with a Panzerfaust aimed at the main entrance. The heavy wooden doors, reinforced for centuries, were a single blast away from splintering into toothpicks. Lee looked at his remaining 7 Americans and the handful of Germans still able to fight. Their faces were blackened by soot and weary from a night of constant vigilance. The besotten Jenny continued to burn in the courtyard, the heat of the fire cracking the stones beneath its treads. They were trapped in a medieval cage, outgunned and facing an enemy that took no prisoners. The Alamo of the Alps was reaching its final act, and as the SS prepared for the final rush, the silence between the bursts of gunfire felt like the breath of the grave. Every man in the castle understood the grim arithmetic of the moment. Unless a miracle arrived from the valley, the next hour would be their last. By the early afternoon of May 5th, the situation inside Castle Itter had reached a point of absolute, suffocating despair. The ammunition pouches of the American GIs were nearly empty, and the German defenders were down to their last few magazines of rifle ammunition. Lieutenant Jack Lee had already begun the grim process of pulling his men from the outer ramparts, drawing the perimeter into the thick-walled heart of the keep. The besotten Jenny was a blackened, hollowed-out shell, and Major Gangel lay dead in the dust of the courtyard. Communication with the outside world was non-existent. The radio had died with the tank, and the telephone lines had been cut long ago. The SS were no longer probing. They were preparing for the final, bloody rush that would end with the execution of every prisoner and defender within the walls. In this moment of encroaching shadow, Jean Barotra, the former tennis champion whose agility had once captivated crowds at Roland Garros, stepped forward with a proposal that seemed suicidal. Despite Lee's earlier orders for the VIPs to remain hidden, Barotra had fought with the intensity of a career soldier. Now, he offered to do what no armored vehicle or radio could: deliver a message by hand. He argued that if the relief column from the 142nd Infantry Regiment did not know the exact positions of the SS heavy weapons and the desperate state of the castle's interior, they might arrive too late or fall into an ambush themselves. Lee looked at the Frenchman, then at the sheer drop of the castle wall. It was a leap of faith in every sense. Barotra requested a set of American fatigues, stripping away his civilian identity to blend into the chaos of the mountain slopes. After a brief, tense nod from Lee, the athlete vaulted over the stone parapet. He hit the ground running, his lungs burning as he sprinted through a gauntlet of lead and shadows. He moved with a frantic, desperate grace, darting between the thick pines and limestone outcrops while SS machine gunners stitched lines of dust at his heels. Miraculously, Barotra evaded the dragnet of the 17th SS Division. Miles down the road, he burst from the tree line and encountered the lead elements of the American relief force. Fate intervened in the form of René Lévesque, a French-Canadian war correspondent who instantly recognized the tennis star despite his dirt-streaked American uniform. The urgency of Barotra's report, detailing the exact locations of the 88mm gun and the swarming SS infantry, acted as a catalyst for the rescue team. Refusing to stay behind, Barotra climbed onto a tank, guiding the Americans back toward the fortress that had become his cage. Inside the castle, the transition began with a sound that was not a scream or an explosion, but a distant, rhythmic thumping that vibrated through the floorboards. The defenders, crouched in the shadows of the keep with their last rounds chambered, held their breath. The cacophony of the SS assault suddenly shifted from an offensive roar to a confused, panicked shouting. From the valley below, the heavy thunder of American relief tanks began to rake the woods. The constant zip-zip of enemy fire against the masonry slowed, then faltered, as the hunters suddenly became the hunted. A strange, heavy stillness began to settle over the courtyard, punctuated only by the crackle of the burning Sherman and the far-off clatter of retreating boots. The high-tension chaos that had defined the last several hours started to drain away, replaced by an exhausted, hollow silence. Lee stood by a shattered window, his hand trembling slightly as he lowered his Thompson submachine gun. He watched as the first American olive-drab vehicles rounded the bend, the sight of them signalizing the beginning of the end of their ordeal. The path back to safety was no longer a frantic gamble, but a measured, somber realization that the walls had held. The strange alliance had done the impossible. They had survived the crisis, and as the roar of the relief column grew louder, the heavy weight of the siege finally began to lift. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon on the 5th of May, the cavalry finally arrived in a thunderous display of American steel. The sudden, rhythmic hammering of heavy machine guns from the 142nd Infantry Regiment tore through the woods, scattering the SS squads who had been preparing a final Panzerfaust strike against the gatehouse. Within minutes, the terrifying pressure that had strangled Castle Itter for days simply evaporated. The remaining Waffen-SS forces, realizing the tide had turned decisively, melted away into the thick Austrian timber, leaving behind approximately 100 prisoners to be rounded up by the Americans. As the roar of battle faded into a ringing silence, Lieutenant Jack Lee climbed down from the ramparts. His face was a mask of soot and bone-deep exhaustion, his uniform stiff with the salt of sweat and the residue of cordite. He stood in the center of the courtyard, watching the smoke rise from the hollowed-out carcass of besotten Jenny. The strange, fragile bubble of the siege had burst, replaced by the mundane, professional activity of liberating troops. The French dignitaries, men like Reynaud and Daladier, emerged from their fighting positions not as politicians, but as survivors, their eyes reflecting a haunted realization of how close they had come to the end. The victory, however, carried a bitter weight. The defenders gathered near the fountain to account for their losses, 4 wounded and 1 empty space that could not be filled. Major Joseph Sepp Gangle lay beneath a white sheet, a professional soldier who had survived the horrors of the Eastern Front only to fall while protecting a man his country had labeled an enemy. Lee looked at the fallen major, then at the Frenchmen who owed their lives to a German officer's sacrifice. It was a paradox that defied the simple logic of the last 6 years of war. That evening, the evacuation began. The French V-1Ps were whisked away toward Paris, where they would arrive just days before the official German surrender on the 8th of May. For Lee, the war ended with a Distinguished Service Cross and a promotion to captain, though he would carry the memory of that Alpine Alamo until his death in 1973. Kurt Siegfried Schrader, the SS officer who chose humanity, would eventually walk free, his sentence shortened by the very men he had helped defend. In the town of Vorgl, a street would one day bear the name of Sepp Gangle, honoring him as a hero of the resistance. But in those first moments of quiet after the relief, There were no monuments or songs. There was only the smell of cooling metal, the sight of former enemies sharing American rations, and the profound, quiet understanding that in the final hours of the world's greatest darkness, they had found a common light. The most unusual battle was over, leaving behind a stone castle on a hill as a silent witness to the day when the lines between nations blurred and disappeared into the simple, desperate necessity of being human.